All right, so I'm going to show you how to take a Rhino model and sync that with D5. So again, I've brought in this D5 plugin. This will let us render a Rhino model in D5 and synchronize any changes that we make, both with camera views, lighting, materials, and all that. So I'm going to hit synchronize, or we'll say connect to D5 render. So it is connected. Want to synchronize live updates. So it should take all the geometry from this model, synchronize it with D5. So now it's brought that in, and D5 has assets here at the top left. So materials, geometry, people, trees, cars, all of that can be found here. And under assets, there's model. So in this model tab, this has vehicles, people, nature. And then if you go to material, you'll find all of the materials. Pull this out. So these are preset materials. When it says Pro, that means that's kind of the paywall. So clicking on that, you'll notice the prompt for payment comes up. If you want to avoid that, there's plenty of materials that don't have the Pro listed. So all of these are free to use. Okay, so that's the paywall. And then there's also particles, flame, smoke, things like that, scattered objects, lawns, trees. Again, you don't have to pay for this to get a lot out of it, so don't feel like you have to pay for it. Camera display, so here you can choose the view angle. So you can set this if you want kind of a wider angle. You can change the focal length here. So again, wide angle, or if you want verticals to be more true, or closer to an axon, you can do that. Camera clipping plane, so that will set where your camera is cutting. So if you wanted to get closer to the object, I think there's a way to set that. Not sure why that's not working. Depth of field, if you want to kind of blur the background, you can turn this on. You can set the focus to your object and kind of set the blur amount. You can kind of see it along the horizon here, how it's blurring that kind of backdrop. The other thing to avoid with D5 and other of these real-time renders is think about how your scene is going to be dropped into a backdrop. So if you want to have a Photoshop backdrop, maybe then leave your model kind of blank in the background. If you want to have context and actually have a detailed model for the background, think about modeling that in your modeling software in Rhino, and then import that when you bring in your model. The other way to import Rhino models is to go to File, Import, and you can import any of these file types: SketchUp, Rhino, FBX. Any of those will import, and they will show up here. So under this object tab, this is the Rhino model. Anything else that you import will show up here, and then you could either turn it off or lock it if you don't want it to be editable. So that'll be your list of imports. when you're happy with a view and you want to save it, let's say I like this angle, I'm going to say create new scene. So that'll save that one scene so that if I'm working and moving around, I can always click on that and it'll take me to that particular view. If you want to move this and update it, you can click on this update scene and it'll update that view for this particular scene. All right, so we'll add some assets, we'll change the materials around, add some people and trees, and then we're gonna render it. And I'll talk about more of these environment effects. You can change the time of day if you just want the kind of default sun and sky, or you can set an HDRI, which uses an image 360 to calculate the lighting and reflections in a scene. So this HDRI effect, that could be done in V-Ray and Enscape and Rhino. There's pretty much every render software allows you to use an HDRI to create your lighting effect. Okay, but I'm going to set this to geo and sky. So this will just be kind of a manual control of the sun and clouds, which is perfectly fine. So I've set a scene. You can also edit the camera if you want to change that. I keep this where it is. I'll add some assets. So these are, it defaults to all model. You can just go into any of these tabs and find the assets that you're looking for. So people are under character here. So let's say I want to add people to the scene. Just click and drop them in. There's also, if you have to add, multiple people at once, there's ways that you can basically create scatters. So you can brush and have hundreds of people get added instantly. You can scatter them and all that. Same with trees and plants. Those can also be scattered. So we've added a few people. Once you've added assets, you can click on them and use this gimbal tool to move people around. If you have to rotate, you can do that. If you select, and the shortcut is V, so you can click on this person, hit V, and scale if you had to scale this person. Let's say your model came in at the wrong scale, and rather than scaling your model, you decide to scale everything else. I wouldn't recommend that, but if for some reason your geometry came in, you can scale all of these. But again, it's much easier to get your model to the right scale than it is to scale every person that you bring into your scene. And again, if you want to switch back and forth between scale and move, just hit V on your keyboard, and that transforms the gimbal from scale mode to translate mode or move. It often makes sense to put people together as far as, clusters of people. Always group them together. It just looks more realistic. It's more natural. So going back to that scene, these people are in shadow, so I'm going to hold shift or hold control, select both, and I can move them along the horizontal plane by clicking and dragging this. And so we'll go back to that scene, see how it looks. So I have people. I'll add a few trees to give this some background context. So looking at nature, there's a whole category for conifer, broadleaf, and this will give you a person for reference to help you understand the scale. So I'm going to add some trees to the scene. Clicking on it downloads it and lets you add it. So by clicking I can pin this if I want it kind of docked. So adding a few trees, I can do the same thing with other plants. So if I wanted some shrubs, so notice those say Pro, so I'm going to avoid that. Let's say I wanted to add a row of shrubs and I didn't want to have to do it manually. I wanted this to be a path and to kind of scatter along that. Clicking on that shrub, placing it, so I could place it that way. There's also ways to brush these plants on. Let's see. Undock this for a second. So if I go here, let's see. So if I go to this path tool, I can select multiple plants. So if I want, you know, a whole series of shrubs, I can go to that. And I'm going to add a few of these. And if I select them, so I have 2 selected, they show up here. I'll add one more. Oh, looks like all of this is Pro. All right, so I have those 2. We'll just use that. And if I click and then click a second time, it's going to give me a path. So if I wanted this to be my path, if I hit enter, that completes it. And you'll notice it's placing, I guess that was my scatter. Here's the path that it created, and I can increase the size and all of the kind of details of that path. I can increase the width of it, the randomization. This is kind of the placement of the path. Let's say I want these to be closer to the building. So I've added this row of plants and it's random. Let's see. I guess I can't. Okay, so on the right, these are the options. So you can change the direction of the plants if you want them randomly spaced, and then you can increase the number, so the density of it. You can randomize the direction of each plant. Randomize the spacing between plants, randomize the offset. So if you want to create a kind of a wider scene, if you want this to look more natural, you can play with that. I'm going to increase the number to make this more dense. All right, and so all of those plants are now showing up here. Again, let's go back to the scene to see how it looks so far. So I've randomly scattered a few of these and then used a path to drop this in, and this whole thing can be moved at once this way. If I need to rotate this, I can. But it's not very easy. Okay, so I've added plants, trees, people, and again, don't overwhelm the scene. You want to create enough so that there's backdrop, but not have too much in front of your design that it kind of hides the geometry or takes away from the building itself. Okay, the next thing we'll do is add assets. So instead of adding geometry assets, we want to add materials. So I'm going to switch this to material. There's a whole range of different materials that you can use: stone, metal. Let's say I want to have a kind of a black mat. I'm going to use this to create the frame for these windows. So once it downloads, then click on it, and then you just click on the material that you want it to change. And in Rhino, what you'll want to do is make sure each of these materials is set. I still have depth of field on, so it was blurring that. Make sure that each of these is, I like to have it on a different material and a different render material on that in Rhino, so that when I drop in a render material, it applies it to everything that should be that color or material. All right, so I can drop in a material to this roof, and it will hopefully just change the material of the roof, not the walls, not everything else. So again, go to Assets. If I want a metal roof, I can click on that. Click, and then apply it to the roof. And you'll notice that the scale of this is completely off. So I can click on that roof, and then under the inspector on the right, that's all of these properties, I can scroll down and I can stretch the material, so larger or smaller. And I can also change the direction. So if this is 0, I can set this to 90. If I want it to run in this direction. And sometimes if the material isn't mapping correctly, you can click on this triplanar. So with multiple geometries, sometimes the scaling is off, and the way it maps to the surface might be off. So I'm just going to go down and stretch this. So if I want this to be smaller or larger, you can play with that. All right, so you can change the scale here under stretch, and then rotation, and then I set triplanar here. Another thing you can do with the material itself is turn on round corner. This makes it a little bit more realistic, because in the real world you'll never see planes that are this razor sharp. Often there's some three-dimensionality to it. You can increase the radius of this. It just makes it a little bit more realistic when you render the geometry. It just adds a little bit of kind of relief to that surface. I'll show you the difference between when this is on, right, and you see a little bit of relief versus when it's off. And it looks impossibly sharp. So I like to work with this being on. And you'll have to do that for each surface or each material. All right, so I'm going to go back to assets instead of this cornflower yellow. So there's wall paints. So we can choose a wall paint. This will have a little bit of texture, and then after you bring in the wall paint, you can change the color. So let's say we want this maybe a glossy paint. Select that, and you can change the color. So once you've dropped it in, select it, and scroll back up, there's a base color map here, which you can change either as a bitmap, or you can go to this dialog and change the actual color. And then I can desaturate. You can play with all of these. All right. So once I'm happy with that, and again, it's going to change everything that was on that particular layer with that material. So I like to organize my Rhino file with different materials on different layers. So if it's going to have a yellow paint, that's all going to be on one layer. And I can just change the material properties for that layer, and it updates everything on it. And so I'm going to go back to my scene. So I'm pretty happy with this. I've added people. I have the shadows kind of coming at me. You can affect the sun location with this. All right, so it kind of naturally brings the sunlight to be kind of a warmer color when you're affecting the sun location. So you can change the north offset as well if it's not accurate. So think about where the actual sun is, where north is oriented in your Rhino model. I think it defaults to the y-axis as being the north direction. So keep that in mind when you're working in D5. You don't want the sunlight to ever be directly behind you in a render, because then it makes the image look washed out. So try to avoid things like that where you can't really, you can't make out the model. You want it to have some shadow and relief in the scene, but play with it. Make sure that it's dramatic and something that you like. In this case, I have the shadows creating a relief on the wall, and creating a shadow with these window frames. Also notice that I'm above eye level, so maybe I want to bring this down to eye level. So if I set navigation to walk, I can set this and just click eye level. The other thing we can do is level the view. So this is set to eye level, this is in metric. You can also make sure your scene is accurate, you're happy with that. I'm going to update this scene, and so you can do this and kind of set the scene here and play with effects and environment. You can also click on this image and work on it here. So let's say I want more of a dramatic view. You can say custom sun, and you can set the sunlight intensity, sun disk radius, which a higher number here will make a more soft shadow. You can set the altitude of that sun and the azimuth. So if you want to have full control over the sun, you can do that. So once that is set, you can just immediately go ahead and hit render. You can set the proportions of the aspect ratio of your image, field of view, the focal length, and then output the size that you like. If it's just a screen that you're going to be looking at it on, then 4K is plenty. But if you're going to place this on a large board or print it, then maybe consider 6K or 8K. It'll take a little bit longer. I'm going to update this altitude a little bit. Set this to be a little bit softer. So when I'm happy with that, I can hit render. It's going to render it as a JPEG or PNG, depending on what you tell it. There's also, let's see, you can set the aspect ratio. Under effect, you can set the exposure level too. So if you want something that's a little darker or lighter, you can affect that. I'm going to leave this at auto. You can change the kind of white balance. So if you want something that's cooler as an image or warmer, you can play with that. You can have it tint various colors if you want to add that effect here versus Photoshop. Leave that at 0. You can add effects like lens flare. That's when you have the kind of sun in the backdrop. You can play with that. Saturation, if you want this to be a little bit more desaturated, you can play with that. Sometimes this is good for plants. Often the plants become overly saturated, just look unrealistic. You can vignette the image, kind of focus more, adds this black blur along the edges. Outline mode, this will have a line around all of your geometry. So if you want it to look more diagrammatic, you can. You can set the line width. If you have a lot of plants in the model, that can look overwhelming here. Sometimes we add lines in a rendering just to give a little bit more detail to an image, whether you want it to look diagrammatic or not. So you can play with all those settings. And again, I'm going to update this with all of these settings. If you don't want to use the kind of manual control of the sun and sky, you can turn on HDRI and rely on either one of their presets, which show up here, or you can add a custom HDRI image. And when you bring these in, if you're not happy with the backdrop, you can rotate these, and notice it'll change not just the backdrop, but it'll change the sunlight location and the shadow play. So a cloudy scene is going to have more of a soft shadow. You don't see that sharp shadow anymore. Whereas a sunny environment, and again, you can rotate this. You can add, if you want both sun, if you want it to follow the HDRI for the sun location where it grabs the brightest location in the HDRI and uses that, you can set this, or you can set it to custom and change the sun location independently of the HDRI. So let's say I want a particular shadow location, but then I want to be able to rotate my HDRI independently. You can do that. A little bit more cloudy, but notice how the shadow isn't changing with my HDRI moving because I've checked this sun, or I've unchecked the follow HDRI. So bring that back allows me to rotate the backdrop and then rotate the sky. All right, you can also, so here's sunset, and again, play around with these and kind of see what scene you want to set for your particular view. There's a lot of different options here, and for some reason if you're not happy with one of these, you can always add your own. So you can go to Polyhaven or one of those websites and download HDRIs that you use. So I have a bunch that I've collected, and you can use one of these. And then you can add, not sure why this is, so I guess in HDRI mode it won't let me add clouds, but if you want to change the cloud type, you can increase the amount, thickness, but again I had to go back into this geo and sky, so I'm kind of manually affecting the sun and the cloud with this. So if you want more density, height, higher clouds versus lower clouds, speed, direction, all that. If you want fog, fog could be a good way to kind of fill in the backdrop if you don't have a lot of detail or if you don't have a lot of model space back there. Okay, so let's say I'm happy with that. I'm going to hit render, and that'll output the image. Do this. So it's outputting this at kind of this original aspect ratio. The size is here. I could have checked any of these and it would be kind of a larger image, but you're seeing how fast this goes. It's one of the faster real-time render engines out there. It's using your graphics card to render this rather than the CPU. And you'll see the PNG that it saved.